The G20 Leaders Summit in Nazareth, Johannesburg, as we have just seen President Cyril Ramaphosa open that first day of the Leaders Summit, speaking about a declaration, very intent that that's what's going to come out of it. He raised several issues, the issue of critical minerals. He spoke about the financial architecture. One of the things he also spoke about was the need for unity and improvement in the form of reform, so to speak, when it comes to multilateralism. And we have Dr. Frank Lekaba from the School of Governance at Witwatersrand University back with us again. Thanks, Dr. Lekaba. I want to then go back to, because one of the things that when unity is needed and reform certainly is needed, is on, debt review, the debt trap that most African countries face. And I'm just looking at UN data. It shows that by the end of 2023, Africa's external debt was around $1.15 trillion US dollars.
That's a lot.
That's a huge amount.
That's a lot of money. It can fund an energy project in the DR Congo. Fund an energy project that can distribute energy in the entire continent, and that will be a renewable energy. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. Combine that with the illicit financial flows.
Absolutely.
According to the report that is in this report by Trevor Manuel, former minister, finance minister, they say about 88.6 billion US dollars goes unaccounted for in the continent. It's illicit financial flows. That is an illicit financial flow in the informal way. Now calculate the formal one that happens in a formal way that has been normalized. Companies that are doing business in the continent registered in the stock exchanges in their own metropoles. It's another way of illicit outflows in the continent, although that may be a very controversial to put it. But all of it, whether it's done illicitly or it's done illegally, it's accumulation from here. And we're talking about extraction. And that's why President Ramaphosa yesterday was very emphatic to the AU. Guys, we need to talk about processing and beneficiation. As we talk of critical minerals, of course we're talking about critical minerals in the continent and all of that, but you need to start emphasizing issues of processing and beneficiation. And G20 countries, please, when you do engage with African countries, you sign up trade agreements. Help to build this capacity in the continent. So, but the issue of debt is out of control. It's getting out of control. But also, look, the issue of debt is not new. Debt starts from the 1980s with the structural adjustment programs, when the IMF and the World Bank came up with a program to structurally adjust systems of African states to be open to. It was liberalization of African markets. The role of the state must move away from the economy and all of that. By 1990, debt was very high. Agriculture was unsustainable in the continent. We were just producers of raw materials. The exchange rate, export exchange rate, was so unfair to the continent and all of that. So I'm saying since from 1980s, we've been talking about this issue. NEPAD comes through, we say, okay, let's address the issue of debt. We talk about it, it still continues. Now it's in the agenda again. Let's talk about debt. But the issue is we are talking about debt in terms of frameworks and all of that. We're not talking about the real issues, and I think that's why President Ramaphosa says, let's talk about beneficiation. Because that's where the real issues are. You can talk about debt and where the state whether it finances education, infrastructure, but I think it's important to talk about the issue of how states gather revenue out of this, which is through beneficiation and processing. The other thing, Tsepiso, is that as you talk of debt and strategies of getting out of debt, I think we also need to talk about the role of private sector. How private sector plays a role in the continent. For the longest time, African states were told to build infrastructure in energy infrastructure, road infrastructure, railway infrastructure. Get money for that. To do what? For ease of business to, right? For business to come and do business and all of that. But how much, when you compare the value of infrastructure development, infrastructure that is being used by private sector, how much does it amount in terms of the amount of money we have borrowed and in terms of the repayments and the revenue of the country? That's one of the things that I think also we need to talk about.
So in light of that, so there are some civil society organizations and some observers who are saying the problem is the current G20 common framework, saying that it is, really designed to focus on low-income, highly indebted countries, and that there is a need for restructuring, but not under traditional multilateral or bilateral mechanisms because they're difficult. Can you just share your thoughts on that? And what is problematic in your view about this current framework of the G20?
The current framework is the lending rate, among other things, and the lending itself. And the problem with the lending is, I don't know if I said this earlier on, Ethiopia grows at an average of 5%, according to the ADB and World Bank. But Ethiopia is one of the highly indebted countries that is getting to a point of what you call sovereign debt crisis, where it is incapable of, now we can no longer get debt anymore because we are highly indebted. Ethiopia is getting there, but the rate of growth is high. Why has Ethiopia gotten to this point? It's because of the rate of lending, one. Two, the social spending. You loan the money, you spend it on important issues like education, healthcare. But what is the GDP of the country? Okay, you are registering high rates of GDP growth, 5%. That's an enormous growth rate. Where is the money going? Out of this growth rate, it's going to the metropoles. The issue I was talking about, that you have got companies doing business here in the continent, they are registered elsewhere. Theirs is just to accumulate resource extraction and all of that. So it has to change. So the rate of borrowing, but it also should be coupled with the responsibility of the private sector, which is something we are not talking about, that I'm not getting out. I tried to read the report. I read that the report of the panel. The role of private sector is not so much pointed to say what is the role of private sector in easing the burden of loans.
I actually just there was a figure that I saw now, and that has to do with how much or how the bulk of the debt is actually owed to private entities, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I'm just baffled because I was actually looking at it now. But basically, the finding is that the current framework has under-delivered just in terms of the. Okay, so yes, no, I see that it's under-delivered by 13.6 billion US dollars, and that's high risk debt that it reduced it by. So in layman's terms, what are we talking about? And we'll get to the issue of private entities and how much is owed to them, because it seems like a great deal of it is owed to them. But let's talk about why the framework has under-delivered.
Yeah, it's basically the how much countries get out of business and all of that, and that's why they talk of, as a remedy, taxation, that you need to increase taxation and all of that. But dominantly the narrative is, if you tax companies high, you are chasing them away. Is the assumption, right? So if the panel propose that we must tax companies high, will that be a good solution to the issue? I don't think so. I think the triple Ps are important way of doing it. Put the responsibility on private sector to invest in the infrastructure they are going to do. Especially now we're talking of processing and industrialization. Who's going to pay for the build-up of industries? The actual building, construction of industries, the roads, the railways, and all of that. who is going to pay for that? It's expected on the state. But who is going to utilize all of that? Is the companies and all of that. And that's why then the panel says tax. But taxation, I don't believe in it. It's an easy intervention, which for me does not alleviate the problem in the long run. The way to solve this problem, I think, put the responsibility of infrastructure development on the private sector themselves. Let them construct the road. Let them do the industries. Let them build the industries, because they are the ones. So that way they will be much more invested. They will not only invest it in terms of resource extraction, but they will be invested because they've built all of this infrastructure. So they will take ownership of it. They will even take ownership in as far as security of the infrastructure is concerned. Look at the railway and the estimates of how much we need to secure the railway and all of that. And one of the things I find very disturbing is that we are talking of public sector reforms. One of the things is the railway revitalization. So the state is going to revitalize the railways, but private locomotives are the ones that are going to run on this railway. How fair is that? Okay, taxation, okay, I understand. But for me, it's not a fair solution to what private sector gets out of this.
I mean, as you speak about that, I'm thinking of mining companies. They are very wanting in keeping to their developmental commitments in communities. And government has not been able to hold them accountable. So is it because we lack the right policies, or are we just not showing enough commitment to our goals? Because
I like how you put it, Tsepiso, because it puts responsibility on the political leadership. 2 weeks back, at the School of Governance, we held a dialogue funded by Sibanye Stillwater, and the communities that Sibanye is doing business in. It was a huge dialogue. But I was listening at the back of the auditorium, listening to the conversation. The polarized voices in the room. And the blame on the state, the blame on DMR, the blame on some of the community leaders, the blame of councillors, and all of. So this is where the leadership plays a role, harmonizing all these voices, making sure that the community speak in one voice. So in the room you had traditional authorities. They say the mines don't take us seriously when they come into our space. Communities says no, we don't want the kings. The king is captured in our own South African language. The chief is captured. Even the councillor is captured. So that's where the role of the state is. And what I saw is the absence of the role of the state. Osepi, not far from here, just at Bapung, Brits, I hear stories of excavations that are taking place in people's yards.
yes.
It's a widespread phenomenon, apparently. I didn't know. I heard this I was shocked. I was like, where is the state? So so this is among the things about the issue of the hegemony of the state. Hegemony of the state was to the communities, deep into the community. So we need to get the state very right in terms of how it manages business. So the conventional, the contemporary economists, especially liberal economists who say the state must move out of the market, must give responsibilities to the market and all of that, are also eroding that state authority and in a way opening up space, polarizing the space. And so the state needs to play that role. It needs to play a role at negotiating for communities and also reining in on business where they do business.
So just as you're speaking about this case of, and there was a story I think the SABC did where someone or some Samazamas were arrested. I can't remember if it was as a result of whistleblowing but it was this man who was being paid for his house to be used because they went underground. They would build a tunnel, went underground, and they would extract, the gold from a nearby mine. It was such an insane story, but I think it's about regulation and lack of surveillance as well. So the role of community, and I'm talking advocacy here, what are communities doing? The C20, how are they? Because if the mining companies are not meeting their obligations to communities become desperate. So how could we further improve that collaboration?
In answering your question, Kolobeni, is it Kolobeni or Kolobeni, the community that was fighting the mines and DMR, and they won their issue through the courts. It's a very classical case in South Africa. It's a serious lesson as to, in a case where DMR seems to be agreeing with the mining companies and it's not so much beneficial to the community, the mobilization through the civil society organization is very instrumental. But, yesterday we were talking about the issue of anti-corruption, and we're picking on the issue of Brazil's discussion, where in Brazil the emphasis was placed on credibility of law enforcement agencies. So that conversation, we shouldn't leave it to Brazil. We should bring it back here as we are progressing with G20. How are law enforcement agencies credible in helping communities to hold mining companies accountable? How are law enforcement agencies helping even with the issue of the Zamazamas? The sad stories that of Stilfontein, where the mastermind apparently escaped.
Yes.
From how can it be? How can it be that the kingpin will escape the police just like that? So the credibility of law enforcement, that's one facet to it. The other facet to it is the role of civil society organized in the communities. But the problem is, and from the discussions we had from the dialogue I was sharing here with Tsepi, is that the communities were saying, even civil society organizations, we don't trust them. We suspect they are in the pockets of the big business and all of that. So the issue of trust in terms of civil society organization, trust in terms of the state and state institutions, that includes law enforcement agencies, human rights commission, and all of that. So it's a multiplicity of things here, and this is where the C20 is very important. I was so disappointed that it was divided at first. The civil society, they couldn't even go ahead with getting a declaration and all of that. But I think, civil society is also one aspect that is highly polarized. The interests are clashing and all of that. But the point is, we have a case here that we have learned from Ekolobeni that can serve as a base case study on how to hold the state and the mining company accountable.
So just in terms of going back to what President Ramaphosa spoke about, the need for solidarity, and I'd imagine mostly here we're talking about the global south.
Yes.
Because it bears the disproportionate burdens of a lot of the challenges that we face, whether it's hunger, inequality, and we're talking now about the need for structural changes, whether it's the financial architecture, whether it's multilateralism. But it seems that it is hamstrung because the big powers that they find themselves beholden to, that's where the picture's not budging. And I'm just thinking of what happens at the United Nations, for instance, at the Security Council, on issues to do with the Middle East conflict. We've seen certain African countries take a stance. And it's really basically about saving one's own skin. But this is the moment. We've been talking about the G20 as the African moment. And what is your optimism levels about how we're going to come out of this? Are we, and I'm just talking about the support that that South Africa will get from other African countries. I'm talking past the declaration now. There's a declaration, and then we're in the crosshairs with the United States and those of its allies.
Look, Tsepi, the solidarity, I think if you listen to the president earlier on, he put solidarity above almost everything. Solidarity and coming to this G20. I think I think that's why then you see the president of the EU sitting right next to the president, President Ramaphosa. Among other things, why the EU is so important is because the EU, I think, is the first, if my memory serves me well, after the whole announcement of the tariffs, is the first to come up to South Africa and say, we are available, we are the alternative market, we are willing to grow in fact, they were asserting their position as the largest investor, to say, we remember we are here, we are the biggest market. And now when we are talking, when the talks of the declaration were now dominant talks, you also see the EU also say, no, we're going to of course not be so much hostile to the declaration. One of the things also here is the role of France. You know,
Yes.
these middle powers. The role of France, the foreign policy of France in the continent may be unpalatable to us who are progressive, who consider ourselves as Pan-Africanists. But coming to this G20, the voice of France was one of those voices that was very important. Emmanuel Macron focused on the G20, keeping focus on it, going to a Freedom Park, talking about the role of those three French who were involved in the liberation struggle, kind of saying, France, we've got your back, South Africa, as France. And looking at also the role that France has assumed in terms of the conflict in the Middle East, Palestine and Israel, where Emmanuel Macron, when the 20-point agreement was announced by the White House, he convened alternative voices to say we must have an alternative, we must look at this scheme.
Right.
In fact, the UN must play much more role here. The peace mission that must be sent there, it must be our initiative. So that the role of many players here and in supporting South Africa is a very interesting thing of solidarity.
Dr. Lekaba, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there with you, but we do appreciate your time coming to speak with us, sharing with us your insights around the G20 and some of the major issues that are under discussion. This is Channel Africa, the African perspective. Africa is one big family, different languages, and we are going to bring in our colleagues now from the Portuguese desk, and we hand over to my colleague Jacob Tevane to hear how he and the team at the Portuguese desk have been absorbing and really interpreting events at the G20. Jacob?